Let me tell you something that might change everything you thought you knew about that tightness in your chest, that racing mind at 3 in the morning, that constant hum of unease that follows you through your days. What if I told you that your anxiety isn't the problem? What if I told you it's actually the solution trying to break through? You've been taught to see anxiety as a malfunction, haven't you? A chemical imbalance to be corrected, a weakness to be overcome, a flaw in your programming that needs fixing. The pharmaceutical companies have their pills ready, the self-help gurus have their techniques packaged and priced, and everyone around you seems to be whispering the same message. Something is wrong with you. But here's what nobody's telling you. What I've spent years discovering through my own descent into that dark water, and what I've witnessed in countless others who've made the same journey. Your anxiety isn't broken. The world is broken, and your anxiety knows it. I remember the first time this truth hit me, really hit me, not just as an intellectual concept, but as a lived reality that rearranged everything. I was sitting in my therapist's office, drowning in shame about my inability to simply function normally, to show up to my corporate job with a smile, to pretend that the fluorescent-lit cubicle and the manufactured urgency of quarterly reports meant something real. She asked me a simple question that cracked everything open. What if your anxiety is appropriate? 3 words that changed the trajectory of my entire life. What if your anxiety is appropriate? Think about it for a moment. You wake up to an alarm clock that jolts you out of whatever dream or rest your body desperately needs. Because somewhere, someone decided that 9 to 5 were the sacred hours of productivity. You rush through a morning routine designed for efficiency rather than presence, gulping down coffee to artificially stimulate a nervous system that's already overstimulated. You commute through traffic or squeeze into public transportation with hundreds of other humans, all of you studiously avoiding eye contact, all of you pretending this is normal. You arrive at an office where natural light is an afterthought, where you'll spend the next 8 or 9 or 10 hours staring at screens, sending emails that could have been conversations, attending meetings that could have been emails, contributing to projects whose purpose you can barely articulate when someone asks you at a dinner party what you actually do all day. And then you come home, exhausted not from physical labor or meaningful accomplishment, but from the sustained effort of being something you're not, performing a role, suppressing your actual thoughts and feelings and needs. You scroll through social media where everyone else seems to be thriving, achieving, radiating success and happiness. You watch shows or play games or do anything to distract yourself from the gnawing sense that something essential is missing. And through all of this, your body is screaming. Your nervous system is sending up flares. Your anxiety is pulling the alarm because it knows, on some deep cellular level, that this isn't what you were made for. This isn't how humans are supposed to live. The canary doesn't have a defect when it dies in the coal mine. The canary is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, detecting the poison that thicker-skinned creatures can't sense yet. You are the canary, and your sensitivity isn't weakness. It's a gift wrapped in suffering, a messenger that arrives in pain, because pain is the only language loud enough to break through all the noise and numbness of modern life. We need to talk about 2 different animals here, 2 types of anxiety that get lumped together but are fundamentally different creatures. There's neurotic anxiety, the kind that spins elaborate fantasies about futures that will never happen, that catastrophizes and amplifies and creates suffering out of pure imagination. This is the anxiety that keeps you awake rehearsing conversations you'll never have, replaying embarrassments from years ago, constructing disaster scenarios about things that have a 0.001% chance of occurring. This anxiety is often a symptom of privilege, honestly. The luxury of a mind that has too much time and safety to worry about imaginary threats, because the real ones have been temporarily solved. But then there's existential anxiety, And this is the one nobody wants to talk about because acknowledging it means acknowledging that something is fundamentally wrong, not with you, but with everything around you. Existential anxiety is what you feel when your authentic self, that core of who you really are beneath all the conditioning and performance, recognizes the massive gap between how you're living and how you could be living, how you should be living, how every cell in your body knows you're meant to be living. This anxiety isn't creating problems out of nothing. It's detecting real problems that everyone else has decided to ignore or numb or rationalize away. People often ask me, but didn't humans always experience anxiety? Isn't this just part of the human condition? And yes, absolutely, humans have always grappled with the awareness of mortality, with uncertainty, with the mystery of existence. But what we're experiencing now is something different in scale and nature. Our ancestors faced genuine threats, immediate dangers, real challenges that engaged their whole being in response. When they felt fear, it was because there was a predator in the grass, or a storm approaching, or a rival tribe at the borders. Their anxiety had an object, a purpose, and when the threat passed, so did the anxiety. What you're experiencing isn't that. You're experiencing the sustained, chronic, low-grade terror of living in a world that contradicts human nature at every turn. Your body evolved over millions of years to live in small communities where you knew everyone's name and story. It evolved to move constantly, to work with your hands, to solve immediate practical problems, to rest when tired, and eat when hungry, and sleep when dark, and wake with light. It evolved to find meaning in ritual and connection and direct relationship with the living world around you. And now you're trapped in artificial environments, under artificial light, eating artificial food, having artificial relationships mediated through screens, doing artificial work that produces nothing tangible, living by artificial schedules that ignore every natural rhythm your body remembers. The question isn't why you're anxious. The question is why everyone isn't more anxious, or rather, why so many people have successfully numbed themselves enough to function in this fundamentally dysfunctional system. The anxious person hasn't failed at being human. The anxious person is succeeding at being human in an inhuman world, and that success manifests as suffering. Let me take you back in history for a moment, because context changes everything. In traditional societies, across virtually every culture and continent, the people who felt too much, who sensed too deeply, who couldn't just go along with the program, these people weren't pathologized. They were recognized as having a gift. They became the shamans, the healers, the medicine people, the ones who could travel between worlds and bring back wisdom. Their sensitivity was understood as a feature, not a bug. Their ability to perceive what others couldn't see, to feel what others couldn't feel, made them valuable, sacred even. When did we lose this understanding? When did we decide that the people who can sense poison in the air are the problem, rather than the poison itself? It happened gradually, I think, as we built societies that required conformity and compliance to function, as we created economic systems that needed workers who wouldn't question, who would show up on time and perform repetitive tasks and consume according to script. The sensitive ones, the questioners, the ones whose anxiety made them inconvenient, they became problems to be solved rather than profits to be heeded. Watch a young child, really watch them, before the world has trained them out of themselves. They live entirely in the present moment. When they're playing, they're completely absorbed in play. When they're sad, they cry fully, and then the crying passes, and they're done. When they're curious about something, they investigate with their whole being. They don't think about yesterday, or worry about tomorrow. They don't optimize or strategize or perform. They just are, fully and completely, moment by moment. And then we begin the process of civilizing them, which is really the process of teaching them to betray themselves. We teach them to sit still when their bodies want to move, We teach them to be quiet when they want to express. We teach them to postpone joy, to delay gratification, to think about the future, to worry about what others think, to measure themselves against others, to achieve and acquire and become. By the time they're adults, that natural way of being is buried under layers of conditioning so thick they can't even remember what it felt like to simply exist without constant mental narration and evaluation. And their anxiety is the sound of that buried authentic self, hammering on the walls of its prison, screaming to be recognized and released. What I'm describing isn't just your personal struggle, it's collective. It's the story of our entire civilization. We've created a world that requires us to disconnect from almost everything that makes us fully human. We've disconnected from nature, spending our lives in climate-controlled boxes, barely aware of seasons or weather except as inconveniences. We've disconnected from our bodies, treating them as vehicles for our heads, as problems to be solved with exercise routines and diets rather than as sources of wisdom and guidance. We've disconnected from meaningful work, trading our labor for currency, in systems where we rarely see the full fruits of what we create or how it serves others. We've disconnected from genuine community, replacing the intimacy of knowing and being known with the hollow performance of networking and social media connections. And perhaps most painfully, we've disconnected from any sense of the sacred, any relationship with mystery and meaning that goes beyond material accumulation and personal comfort. We live in a world that tells us we're just random arrangements of molecules, that consciousness is an accident, that meaning is something we make up to distract ourselves from the void, that death is the end of everything, so we better grab what we can while we're here. Is it any wonder that such a worldview produces anxiety? Your anxiety knows something that your rational mind keeps trying to deny. It knows that you weren't made for this. It knows that something essential has been lost. It knows that beneath all the stuff and status and success you've accumulated or are trying to accumulate, there's an emptiness that won't be filled by anything this world is currently offering. So here's where we reach the crucial question, the fork in the road where everything changes depending on which path you choose. What do you do with this anxiety? The conventional wisdom says to treat it, manage it, cope with it, overcome it, take the medication, do the cognitive behavioral therapy, practice the mindfulness techniques, implement the self-care routines. And listen, I'm not dismissing any of those tools. They can be useful, sometimes necessary, often helpful in creating enough space to function. But here's what I want you to consider. What if the goal isn't to eliminate your anxiety? What if the goal is to understand what it's telling you and then actually change your life in response? This requires a radical shift in perspective. Instead of seeing anxiety as an enemy to be defeated, you begin to see it as a wise teacher that's been trying to get your attention. Sometimes for years, sometimes for your entire life. Instead of asking, how do I make this stop? You start asking, what is this trying to show me? What am I being called toward or away from? I spent years trying to cure my anxiety, throwing everything at it, anything that promised relief. And some things helped temporarily, but the anxiety always returned because I wasn't addressing what it was actually pointing to. It wasn't until I started listening to it, actually sitting with it, instead of running from it or fighting it, that everything shifted. The anxiety was telling me that my job was slowly killing my soul. It was telling me that I was spending time with people who drained me and avoiding people who nourished me. It was telling me that I'd structured my entire life around what I thought I should want, rather than what I actually wanted. It was telling me that I'd become a stranger to myself, and that the path back to authenticity would require courage I wasn't sure I possessed. When you listen to anxiety this way, it becomes a compass. It points you toward what's misaligned, toward where you're betraying yourself, toward where the gap between your authentic nature and your lived reality has grown too wide to ignore any longer. And yes, following that compass is terrifying because it usually requires significant change. It might mean leaving relationships that look good on paper, but feel hollow in reality. It might mean walking away from career paths that took years to build, but lead nowhere you actually want to go. It might mean disappointing people, confusing people, having people think you've lost your mind. But here's what I've found, both in my own life and in witnessing others who've made this journey. The anxiety that comes from living authentically is so much lighter than the anxiety that comes from betraying yourself. When you're anxious because you're taking risks that matter, because you're being honest even when it's uncomfortable, because you're choosing connection over safety, that anxiety has a different quality. It's cleaner, sharper. It doesn't have that heavy, murky, suffocating quality of the anxiety that comes from spending your one precious life pretending to be someone you're not. The changes don't have to be dramatic or sudden. In fact, they usually work better when they're small and gradual. You start spending more time in nature, letting yourself remember that you're an animal that evolved to live outdoors, under sky, among trees and water and earth. You notice how your nervous system responds to this, how something in you relaxes and remembers and comes home. You begin having more honest conversations, expressing what you actually think and feel rather than what you think people want to hear. You discover that the relationships that can't handle your honesty weren't serving you anyway, and the ones that deepen through your authenticity become sources of real nourishment. You examine your work and ask whether it contributes to something you believe in, whether it uses your actual gifts, whether it connects you to other humans in meaningful ways. If the answers are all no, you begin exploring alternatives, even if just in your imagination at first. You create space in your life for things that don't produce anything, don't accomplish anything, don't lead anywhere except deeper into the present moment. You sit and do nothing. You watch clouds. You have conversations that meander. You make things with your hands just for the joy of making. You question everything you've taken for granted about how life should be structured. Why do you live where you live? Why do you spend time with who you spend time with? Why do you do what you do all day? Not in a destructive, nihilistic way, but in a genuinely curious way. What would it look like to build a life from the inside out, starting with who you actually are and what you actually need, rather than from the outside in, trying to fit yourself into predetermined templates? This is hard work, maybe the hardest work there is, because it goes against everything you've been taught and everything the culture reinforces every single day. The culture needs you to keep consuming, keep producing, keep striving, keep performing. Your anxiety is asking you to stop, to look around, to remember who you are beneath all that, to reclaim your life from the forces that would use it up in service of their agendas rather than yours. And here's the thing, you don't have to do this alone. In fact, you can't do it alone. One of the messages your anxiety is delivering is that you need genuine community, real connection with others who are asking the same questions and wrestling with the same tensions. Find those people. They're out there, also feeling like aliens in this world, also sensing that something is profoundly wrong with the way we're all supposed to be living. Find them online. Find them in your local community. Find them in unexpected places. Share your truth and watch who resonates. Build relationships based on reality rather than performance. The path I'm describing isn't easy, and it doesn't make the anxiety disappear overnight, or maybe ever completely. But it transforms the anxiety from something that's happening to you into something you're working with, a source of information and guidance, rather than just suffering. You develop a different relationship with discomfort. You become curious about it rather than terrified of it. You learn to distinguish between the anxiety that's warning you about real misalignment and the anxiety that's just your nervous system's habitual response to uncertainty. I want to pause here and ask something of you, something that might seem simple but is actually profound. If this is resonating with you, if you're recognizing your own story in what I'm sharing, I want you to do two things. First, Consider subscribing to this channel because we need community. We need to know we're not alone in this, and these conversations are how we find each other. But more importantly, I want you to stop right now and ask yourself one question. Really ask it. Sit with it until an honest answer emerges. What is one thing in your life that your anxiety has been trying to tell you about? One specific thing that you know isn't right, but you've been avoiding looking at directly? Don't tell me the answer, not yet, but hold that question. Let it work on you. Write it down if that helps. Share your answer in the comments if you feel called to, because your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to give themselves permission to be honest too. There's something else I need you to understand about this journey of listening to your anxiety, rather than just trying to eliminate it. You're going to be tempted to turn this into another self-improvement project, another thing you're doing wrong that needs fixing, another way you're failing. The voice in your head will say, "Great, so now I'm not only anxious, I'm also failing at properly understanding and responding to my anxiety." Please, please don't do that to yourself. This isn't about adding more pressure or more standards you're not meeting. This is about releasing pressure, about giving yourself permission to be human in a world that's constantly demanding you be a well-oiled machine. There will be days when you can't listen to your anxiety, when you just need to get through, when you have to take the medication or use the coping mechanism or numb out a bit because that's all you have capacity for in that moment. That's okay. That's part of being human too. This isn't about perfection or purity. It's about gradually, over time, with setbacks and failures and messy, non-linear progress, beginning to live more honestly, more authentically, more in alignment with who you actually are. The people in your life might not understand. They might think you're having a breakdown when you're actually having a breakthrough. They might worry about you when you start making changes that don't fit the script everyone agreed to follow. They might even try to talk you out of it, to convince you to get back in line, to take the drugs and shut up and be normal again. This will hurt, especially when it comes from people who love you and genuinely think they're helping. Try to remember that they're scared too, that your changes might threaten their own denial, that watching you break free might make them feel the weight of their own chains more acutely. But you'll also find allies in unexpected places. The cousin who always seemed so conventional will reveal that she's been struggling with the same questions. The colleague who seemed perfectly content will confide that they've been feeling like a fraud for years. The neighbor you barely know will share something that lets you know they see it too. This fundamental wrongness with how we're all living. These moments of recognition, of being truly seen and seeing truly, they're like water in a desert. They remind you that you're not crazy, that your anxiety isn't lying to you, that there are others who are feeling this too and trying to find their way through. One of the most liberating realizations you can have is that you don't have to figure it all out at once. You don't need a complete blueprint for a new life before you take the first step. You just need to be willing to acknowledge what's true, even when that truth is uncomfortable or inconvenient. You just need to make one small choice in the direction your anxiety is pointing, and then another, and then another. The path reveals itself as you walk it. The clarity comes from moving, not from thinking about moving. So what does this actually look like in practice? Let me get concrete, because the philosophical stuff is important, but the practical application is where transformation happens. You start paying attention to your body's responses instead of just your thoughts about your thoughts. When you're in a conversation with someone, do you notice your shoulders relaxing or tightening? When you're at work, do you feel energized or drained? When you're planning your weekend, are you excited or trying to make yourself want to do things you think you should want to do? These bodily sensations are your anxiety speaking a language older than words. Your rational mind can rationalize anything, can explain away any discomfort, can convince you that what's obviously wrong is actually fine. But your body doesn't lie. That knot in your stomach when you see certain names pop up on your phone, that heaviness in your chest on Sunday evenings before the work week begins, that restlessness that drives you to scroll endlessly through content that doesn't really interest you, these are all messages. Start reading them. And as you begin making changes, as you start honoring what your anxiety is revealing, you'll notice something interesting. The anxiety doesn't go away, not completely, but it changes form. It becomes less diffuse, less everywhere and nowhere. Instead of free-floating dread that colors everything, it becomes more specific, more targeted. You'll feel anxiety about particular things you're doing or not doing, and that specificity is actually useful. It gives you information you can act on rather than just a general sense that everything is wrong. You might find that your anxiety about social situations decreases as you become more honest in your relationships. But your anxiety about your financial situation increases as you acknowledge that your current career path is unsustainable. That's progress, even though it might not feel like it. Diffuse anxiety is paralyzing. Specific anxiety is informative. You can work with specific anxiety. You can make a plan, take action, move toward something or away from something. The discomfort has purpose now, instead of just being ambient suffering. I've been talking for a while now, and I want to bring this home, to give you something solid to take with you. The message I most want you to hear is this: your anxiety is not your enemy. It's not a malfunction. It's not proof that you're weak or broken or failing at life. It's your most authentic self refusing to be silenced, insisting on being heard, demanding that you pay attention to the gap between how you're living and how you could be living. It's uncomfortable, yes. It's painful, absolutely. But it's also potentially the most important voice you'll ever learn to listen to. The world wants you to medicate it away, to cope with it, to manage it just enough so you can keep functioning within systems that don't serve your deepest needs. And sometimes survival requires that. Sometimes you need those tools just to make it through. But don't let survival become your only goal. Don't let coping become a substitute for changing. Your anxiety is inviting you into a bigger, truer, more authentic life. One where you're not constantly betraying yourself, where you're not spending all your energy pretending to be someone you're not, where you're not waiting for some future moment to finally start living honestly. The journey isn't easy. And it isn't quick. There's no 5-step program, no simple hack, no magic bullet that makes it all instantly better. It's a practice, a daily choice to listen instead of suppress, to honor instead of override, to trust that discomfort that's pointing you toward truth. Some days you'll do it well. Some days you'll fall back into old patterns. Both are part of the process. Be gentle with yourself. Be patient. Be persistent, and remember this: you're not alone. There are millions of us out here feeling this same thing, asking these same questions, trying to find our way back to something more real and true and alive. We're all stumbling through it, learning as we go, making mistakes and course corrections, and occasionally having breakthroughs that change everything. We need each other for this journey. We need to share our stories, our struggles, our small victories and big failures. We need to build communities based on honesty rather than performance, on mutual support rather than competition, on celebrating each other's authenticity rather than judging each other's conformity. So here's what I want to ask as we close this conversation. If something I've said has touched you, if you've felt that spark of recognition that tells you this is true, even though it's hard, I invite you to join this community. Subscribe to this channel not because I need the numbers, but because we need each other. Share your story in the comments. Tell us what your anxiety has been trying to tell you. Let others know they're not alone by being honest about your own experience. What's the one thing you're going to do differently after hearing this? What's the first small step toward listening to your anxiety instead of just fighting it? What truth have you been avoiding that you're ready to finally acknowledge? Your story matters. Your struggle matters. Your anxiety, uncomfortable as it is telling you something that matters. Listen to it. Honor it. Let it guide you back to yourself. And know that in doing so, you're not just healing yourself, you're participating in something larger, a collective awakening to the possibility that we don't have to keep living this way, that there are other options, that authenticity is possible even in a world that constantly demands performance. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for having the courage to feel what you feel, even when the world tells you to just get over it. Keep going. Keep questioning. Keep listening to that voice inside that knows, that's always known, that there's something more true and real and alive waiting for you on the other side of fear. I'll see you in the next conversation.